So if I told you that the terrifying rise of the Nazi war machine, like the most destructive force in human history, was fundamentally made possible by American banking policies, cheap plastic radios, and 2.5 million horses, you'd probably think I was completely out of my mind.
Oh, totally. I mean, you'd think, no, it was this highly modernized, unstoppable wave of tanks led by some sort of evil genius.
Right, exactly. But today, we are tossing out that really comfortable, simplified, high school textbook version of World War II. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So our mission today is to understand the precise, astonishingly complex mechanics of how a failed, socially awkward artist actually managed to orchestrate a global catastrophe.
Because, we have this tendency to look back at catastrophic historical events and view them as these inevitable monolithic surges of evil.
Yeah.
It kind of helps us sleep at night to think there was just a singular, highly visible villain who hypnotized a nation. But when you look at the granular reality, the actual historical analysis we're digging into today, the landscape is incredibly murky.
It really is.
It's this massive web of economic domino effects, societal trauma, and literal smoke and mirrors.
Which is exactly why you, listening right now, need to stick with us for this one. Because you might think you know this story inside and out. But the sheer amount of historical mythology we're about to dismantle today is wild.
Oh, yeah.
From the actual surprising truth about the whole concept of blitzkrieg to the real reason the democratic Weimar Republic collapsed, it will completely change how you view the fragility of our own modern society.
Absolutely. We're looking at how a nation's psychology can be hijacked when the economic floor basically just falls out from under it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to start with the individual before we can even begin to understand the macro-level collapse of a whole nation. So we start in Vienna, right before the First World War.
Right.
With a deeply flawed, really resentful individual.
Yeah, to understand the macro trauma of Germany, you absolutely have to understand the baseline psychological profile of the man who would eventually scale his own profound personal resentment up to a national and then a global level. We're talking about the early life of Adolf Hitler in Vienna. It's a period that people often gloss over to get to the war, but it is foundational.
Right, they just skip to the 1930s.
Exactly. But in the years leading up to 1914, he is living in a total state of failure. I mean, he's a failed artist, living in squalor in a Viennese garret. And when we say failed, we mean everything he attempts to build a life around completely disintegrates.
I always found the specifics of that artistic failure fascinating, because it wasn't just that he couldn't paint right.
Right.
Technically speaking, his draftsmanship of buildings and architecture was actually quite proficient. Like, if he had wanted to be a purely technical architectural draftsman, he might have found a lane.
He could have had a career, yeah.
But his paintings of human figures, they were totally devoid of soul or human vitality.
Yeah, totally doubt it.
Contemporaries describe them as flat, like cheap, mass-produced postcards.
Well, and what's fascinating here is what that artistic deadness tells us about his capacity for human connection at that time.
Right.
He was an incredibly angry, isolated young man. He's been described retrospectively in these sources as a somewhat spectrum-y character in his social interactions, meaning he simply did not make friends easily.
He just couldn't connect.
Exactly. He couldn't read the room, he couldn't interact with people smoothly, and he was just boiling over with this toxic resentment. He genuinely believed he was a genius destined for greatness,
Yeah, the classic delusion.
But he was constantly let down by the world, getting into petty disagreements, alienating anyone who tried to help him, and just ending up impoverished.
So he is entirely adrift, just a ghost in a major European capital.
Oh.
But then comes August 1914. World War I breaks out, the mobilization orders go out, and for this totally isolated, resentful guy, the outbreak of the deadliest war in history up to that point is absolute salvation.
Salvation is the perfect word for it. Joining the military gave him a sense of belonging, a rigid structure, a purpose, and a camaraderie that he had quite literally never experienced in his entire life. He was no longer the weird outsider in the garret. He was part of a grand collective.
Yeah.
He put on a uniform, and suddenly he had worth.
And he spent most of the war on the Western Front as a dispatch runner.
Yeah.
And by all historical accounts, he was conspicuously courageous. I mean, he ran through artillery fire, he did his job well, he won the Iron Cross.
You did, yeah.
But, and this is a crucial detail that punctures so much of the later Supreme Commander mythology we see in movies, he never rose above the rank of lance corporal.
Right, he was a one-stripe man.
Exactly.
He was never this grand strategic military commander in the trenches. He was a low-ranking soldier who had finally found a tribe that would accept him. The patriotic fervor just consumed his entire identity. But then we hit the autumn of 1918.
Right.
The sudden, shocking, and to the German public, utterly inexplicable end of the war.
And we really have to set the stage for why that ending was so shocking. Because context is everything here. Earlier that same year, in March 1918, Germany had just secured a massive historic victory against Russia with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk.
It was huge.
Right. They had essentially knocked Russia out of the war completely. They claimed vast swaths of territory, the Baltic states, Ukraine, parts of Poland. It was a monumental triumph on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, and the German public and soldiers like Hitler, they looked at that Eastern victory and assumed it was the turning point.
Obviously.
They thought, we're no longer fighting a two-front war. The expectation across the nation was that they would take all those troops from the East, hurl them at the Western Front, and secure a final, glorious victory.
Right, bring everyone west.
But the military reality was vastly different. They completely overextended themselves in their spring offensives. They reached what military strategists call their culmination point.
Oh, culmination point. Explain that really quickly for those who might not know.
Sure, it's the exact moment where your supply lines are stretched too thin, your troops are exhausted, and your tactical flexibility just collapses.
Got it.
So the British and French counterattacked, the fresh American troops began pouring in, the German domestic economy was starving due to naval blockades.
Boy, the blockades are brutal.
Absolutely brutal, and the whole military apparatus just shattered.
And where is our lance corporal when this collapse happens?
Yeah.
He's lying in a hospital bed in Passwalk. He's been blinded by a British mustard gas attack.
Right.
But the blindness wasn't just physical tissue damage from the gas. There was a severe psychotrauma happening in his head. He essentially experiences a hysterical blindness brought on by the shock of the defeat.
He emerges from that hospital into a world that has been turned completely upside down. I mean, think about what he has lost.
Everything.
His tribe, his singular purpose in life, the military structure that literally saved him from starving in Vienna. It is all gone overnight. He is back to being a nobody, but now he is a nobody in a defeated, starving, and broken nation. The micro-trauma of his profound personal loss perfectly mirrors the macro-trauma of Germany itself.
I try to picture this in a modern context, you know? It's like, think about a modern-day radicalized internet troll.
No, that's a good comparison.
Right. Someone who's totally isolated offline, deeply resentful, constantly feeling rejected by society. And then suddenly they find this massive, highly militarized, real-world mob that completely validates their anger, gives them a uniform, and tells them they are a hero.
Yeah.
And then completely out of the blue, that mob is disbanded by the authorities, and the guy is sent back to his lonely basement. The sheer rage, the psychological snap that would cause, is terrifying.
That analogy captures the emotional whiplash perfectly. I mean, he had tasted profound belonging, and then it was violently snatched away. He didn't have a trade to go back to. He didn't have a wife or a family to support him. He just had his immense resentment, which was now supercharged by the humiliation of his adopted country.
So let's talk about that national humiliation, because this bridges us into the years between 1919 and 1923. How does this one angry, traumatized, unemployed veteran translate his personal misery into an actual political movement?
Right, because he doesn't do it in a vacuum.
Exactly. He taps into the collective trauma of a nation that feels it has just been kicked face first into the mud by the rest of the world.
And the mechanism for that humiliation is the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919. Germany gets absolutely dismantled. It's not just a matter of losing a war, right? It's a complete economic and territorial castration.
Right.
They are stripped of all their overseas colonies. Vital European buffer states and resource-rich regions like Alsace-Lorraine and parts of Prussia are just taken away. Their military is reduced to a glorified police force of just 100,000 men.
Barely an army at all.
Barely. And worst of all, they're forced to accept the war guilt clause. This dictate that says the entire cataclysm of the First World War was solely their fault, making them liable for crippling, astronomical financial reparations.
Which is, let's be honest, a massive historical oversimplification.
Oh, completely.
The diplomatic tangles, the secret alliances, the mobilization schedules that started World War I were a collective European failure. Blaming Germany unilaterally was punitive to the extreme.
Yeah, it was vindictive.
So you have millions of traumatized combat veterans coming back, to a society that is completely breaking down. They are dealing with unprecedented hyperinflation, where the currency becomes literal paper waste. I think we've all seen those pictures of people taking wheelbarrows of cash to buy a single loaf of bread.
Right, where the price goes from 10 million marks in the morning to 100 million marks by the evening. It's absurd.
It's completely unlivable.
Exactly. And in that environment of absolute terrifying chaos, where traditional society has completely failed, Hitler discovers his one true, undeniable talent. Ironically, it starts when the military authorities, well, the remnants of the army actually take pity on him.
Oh, I remember this. They give him a job, right?
Yeah, they give him a minor job helping to deliver propaganda courses designed to dissuade young, returning German POWs from embracing Bolshevism or communism.
Wow.
And it is in these small classroom settings that he realizes he is an incredibly gifted orator. He finds that when he speaks, he can tap into the exact frequency of the room's anger. He can hold a crowd completely captive.
So he ends up in Munich, and the army actually sends him to spy on a meeting of a tiny, obscure political group called the DAP, the German Workers' Party.
Right, meeting in a murky beer cellar.
Leaving in a basement. And this group is beyond fringe. They are steeped in these esoteric, woo-woo ancient Aryan myths handed down from the Thule Society.
Oh, yeah, total mystical nonsense.
Right. They're sitting around drinking beer, talking about Atlantic ice theories, lost Nordic races, just completely bizarre stuff. But Hitler stands up to speak during a debate, and everyone in the room is instantly mesmerized. He doesn't just join the group. Through sheer force of will and oratorical dominance, he quickly takes it over, eventually rebranding it as the NSDAP, the Nazi Party.
And we really have to analyze the psychological allure of the specific messaging he develops in those beer halls. Because he wasn't just rambling. Every major speech followed a very specific, calculated emotional arc.
Okay, what was the arc?
It always started with shared anger. You know, we were robbed, we were cheated, we were stabbed in the back.
Ah, the stabbed in the back myth. Let's pause here, because this is crucial. This wasn't a grassroots conspiracy theory. This was a deliberate lie invented by the top German generals.
Yes, specifically Hindenburg and Ludendorff.
Right. They knew they lost the war on the battlefield, but to save their own reputations and the prestige of the aristocratic military class, they just passed the blame on to the civilian politicians, the Social Democrats, and the Jewish population back home.
Yeah, they essentially said the army was undefeated in the field, but we were betrayed by cowards at home. It is one of the most destructive lies in modern history.
Unbelievable.
The military elite couldn't admit their own catastrophic logistical and strategic failures, so they created a convenient scapegoat. And Hitler weaponizes this lie with devastating effectiveness. He taps into the visceral, unhealed anger of these frontline veterans who felt their immense suffering in the mud and blood of the trenches was rendered totally meaningless.
He validates their paranoia.
He validates it entirely. And this is why he was so dangerous, he doesn't just leave them angry and hopeless. The second half of his speeches always pivoted to a soaring vision of hope and resurrection. We can rise again. Germany can be pure and great again.
To make that hope function, though, you need an in-group and an out-group. He creates a very rigid, clear division. He promotes the concept of the Volksgemeinschaft.
The people's community.
Exactly. This is the us, the true Aryan Germans connected by blood, soil, and culture. And then there is the enemy, the them, the Jews, the Bolsheviks, the Slavs, the international financiers.
Right, and by creating this binary, he offers these lost, traumatized men something incredibly powerful, a gang, a new tribe. If you look at the creation of the SA and the SS, the paramilitary wings of the party, they were specifically designed to offer men a uniform, a rank structure, a sense of discipline, and a return to the military hierarchy they so desperately missed.
Because PTSD wasn't a thing back then.
Exactly. Remember, no one understood PTSD. There were no decompression programs for these soldiers. The movement offered them a tangible way to make sense of their psychological trauma by giving them an explicitly defined enemy to fight and a brotherhood to belong to.
I hear that, but I have to push back a little here on the timeline. Because even with the uniforms and the fiery speeches, at this point in the early 1920s, the Nazis were tinier than the most obscure, laughable fringe groups we have on the internet today.
Oh, absolutely.
They were literally just a few thousand angry guys drinking steins of beer in Bavarian basements. How do you go from a regional nuisance to an actual political threat capable of taking over a modern state? Because they tried the violent route first, right?
They did, and it was a spectacular failure. In November 1923, inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, they attempt the beer hall putsch in Munich.
Right.
They literally try to overthrow the Bavarian regional government by force, hoping it will spark a national revolution. It is badly planned, it's chaotic, and it collapses almost immediately when they march into a police cordon. Shots are fired, people are killed, and the leadership scatters.
This is the famous event where Hermann Goering gets shot in the groin, escapes to Austria, and ends up addicted to morphine while recuperating, right?
Yes, an addiction that defines the rest of his life and his terrible leadership of the Luftwaffe later on.
Wow. And Hitler gets arrested. He's charged with high treason.
Yeah.
In any normal functioning republic, he could have been executed or given life in prison.
Easily.
But because the conservative judiciary in Bavaria secretly sympathized with his nationalist aims, he only gets a slap on the wrist. Just a couple of years in the remarkably comfortable Landsberg prison.
And the failure of the putsch is the pivotal, transformative moment for the movement. Because sitting in that prison cell, Hitler realizes a fundamental truth. He cannot take power by force. The state apparatus is simply too strong.
So he has to pivot.
He is forced to stop being just a reactionary street brawler and start theorizing a grand, comprehensive ideological vision that can actually win mass support legally. This is where he begins dictating the first volume of Mein Kampf.
And this brings us to the creation of what we might call the blueprint for La La Land. This is where the history gets incredibly bizarre and surreal. We know he starts the book in prison, but he actually finishes writing the second part after he gets released early. He goes up to a mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps.
Yes, the Kampfhaus. It's a small, rustic wooden shack nestled up in the trees near Berchtesgaden, and the contrast here is just staggering. You really have to picture the scene. Hitler is pacing around this cabin, formulating this intensely dark, malevolent, genocidal ideology that will eventually consume the entire continent. But his daily routine, he gets up, walks through the pristine, breathtaking beauty of the Alps, surrounded by crisp nature and chirping birds, goes down to a lovely little mountain cafe, and eats Windbeutel.
Windbeutel.
Yeah, which is this delicate, sweet berry and cream pastry.
Yeah.
And he drinks hot chocolate.
He had a massive sweet tooth. It's such a jarring, almost cinematic detail. He's literally sitting there, dabbing whipped cream off his mustache in this picturesque, Sound of Music alpine setting, while systematically mapping out the destruction of millions of people. It feels like a glitch in the Matrix.
It is the ultimate cognitive dissonance. But understanding that picturesque setting is actually vital to understanding how he eventually sold his vision to a highly educated German public.
How so?
Because the ideology he is formulating in that book isn't just a crude manifesto of I hate these specific minority groups. It is framed as a grand, pseudoscientific geopolitical theory of survival. He argues that Germany is fundamentally geographically vulnerable. They are trapped in the center of Europe, surrounded on all sides by potential enemies, and they are severely lacking in vital natural resources like iron ore, oil, and access to the world's oceans because, the British Navy controls the seas.
Right, so his solution isn't to look for overseas colonies in Africa or Asia like the British or French empires did. He argues that's a waste of naval resources they just don't have. His solution is Lebensraum, living space in the East.
That is the core pillar. He looks strictly east to the vast plains of Poland and Ukraine. He believes that for the German race to survive and thrive, they need to push east to secure massive territorial buffer zones.
To get the resources.
Exactly. They need to conquer the endless wheat fields of Ukraine to feed their population. They need to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus to power their industry and control the shipping lanes of the Baltic. He convinces himself, and writes it down as gospel, that this land war is the only mathematical way Germany can survive the 20th century and never be subjected to a starvation blockade again.
And here is the terrifying part about how he packages this to the German people. He doesn't pitch it just as a grim, brutal war of conquest. He pitches it as a utopia, a 1,000-year Reich.
Right.
He promises a future where healthy, robust Aryans are wearing leather shorts, hiking the Alps, breathing fresh air, and living in perfect peace, harmony, and economic security.
It sounds idyllic.
It does. But, and here is the poison pill that beautiful utopia has to be bought with the blood of an inevitable apocalyptic struggle against Judaism and Bolshevism, which he views as intertwined existential threats.
We really have to unpack this La La Land fantasy. Because if we just write him off as a cartoon villain screaming about murder, we fail to understand why millions of rational people followed him.
That's a great point.
He wasn't just selling pure, unadulterated hatred to the masses. He was packaging the hatred inside a highly appealing, grandiose vision of national health, nature, returning to traditional values, and total economic security. He is essentially saying, yes, there will be a terrible, violent struggle, but I am the only one willing to do what is necessary, and on the other side of that violence is this beautiful pastoral Eden for your children. If you are going to sell a radical, violent movement, you have to sell a vision of a better world. And that complete ideological package is what he solidified while eating pastries in the Alps.
But here's the crazy part that completely upends how we view the inevitability of World War II. Even with his detailed blueprint, even with his undeniable oratorical skills and his paramilitary gangs, the Nazi movement completely dies out in the late 1920s.
It really does.
After he gets out of prison, publishes the book, and tries to rebuild the party, nobody cares. In the 1928 national elections, the Nazis win an abysmal 2.6% of the vote. They are politically neutered. They are a laughingstock. Why?
Very simply, because the economy got better.
Which shatters another massive cultural myth we hold about the 1920s in Germany. Whenever we hear about the Weimar Republic, we picture this decadent, hypersexualized, drug-addled cabaret culture.
Right, everyone's wearing heavy eyeliner and dancing in the Kit Kat Club in Berlin while the country rots from the inside out.
Exactly. But that's not true.
No, that specific, enduring image of Weimar as this degenerate, rotting society is actually pure Nazi propaganda designed by Joseph Goebbels.
Wow.
And it is astounding how it still influences our historical memory today. Yes, Berlin had a thriving, liberal, avant-garde nightlife. But the reality of Weimar Germany in the mid to late 1920s was that it was a highly functional, culturally vibrant, democratic society.
They were leading the world in a lot of fields, right?
Oh, absolutely. Engineering, chemistry, astrophysics. This is the era of Albert Einstein and Max Planck. They had the Bauhaus movement revolutionizing modern architecture. It wasn't just cabarets. It was the people who were building massive infrastructure projects like the Möhne and Eder dams. They were an export powerhouse.
So how did they recover from the apocalyptic hyperinflation of 1923 so quickly? How did they go from burning money for warmth to being a global scientific and industrial leader in just a few years? And this is where my mind was absolutely blown during my research. The engine of that recovery was the United States.
American capital was the lifeline. In the 1920s, after WWI, America emerges as the wealthiest, most industrialized nation in the world. They are booming with oil discoveries, assembly line manufacturing, and a massive expansion of credit.
The Roaring '20s.
Exactly. And the U.S. government and Wall Street realize that if Europe completely collapses economically, it's bad for American business.
So they step in with the Dawes Plan in 1924 and later the Young Plan in 1929. The mechanics of this are wild. The U.S. is essentially creating a giant circular flow of money.
Yeah, explain how that works.
Okay, so the U.S. banks loan massive amounts of cash directly to Germany. Germany takes that American cash, stabilizes its currency, builds factories, and uses the surplus to pay their war reparations to France and Britain. Then, France and Britain take that exact same money and send it back to the United States to pay off their own wartime loans.
It was a house of cards dependent entirely on the American financial engine running smoothly.
A total loop.
But while it ran, it worked beautifully for Germany. Because of that influx of U.S. cash, German exports rise, factories are humming, unemployment drops, and people feel secure. And there is a fundamental rule of politics here.
What's that?
When people are securely employed, when they can afford groceries and see a future for their kids, they do not vote for radical, extremist wrecking balls.
Right.
Hitler's apocalyptic message of doom and despair became totally irrelevant because the people looking out their windows saw cranes building new factories, not a collapsing society.
But then
Yeah.
the music stops. October 1929, the Wall Street crash.
The defining economic disaster of the 20th century. $8 to $10 billion in paper wealth is wiped from the New York Stock Exchange in a matter of days. American banks go bust, panic sets in, credit freezes entirely.
And instantly, overnight, the tap of U.S. loans flowing to Germany is completely cut off.
Yep.
American banks are calling in their overseas loans just to survive.
And as if the sudden withdrawal of capital wasn't devastating enough, the United States makes a domestic policy decision that turns a severe financial crisis into a global catastrophe. We are talking about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
Oh, man.
This is perhaps one of the most crucial yet overlooked levers in this entire history. Senators Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley had been working on this massive protectionist tariff bill well before the crash. Their goal was to protect American farmers and domestic industries from cheaper European imported goods by slapping massive taxes on them.
Right.
After the crash hits and panic sets in, they push it through Congress, convinced that walling off the U.S. economy will save American jobs.
Wait, I have to stop here. Because the idea that a couple of American senators trying to help farmers in Idaho inadvertently caused the Third Reich sounds absurd on its face. Didn't anyone warn them what would happen?
They absolutely did. Over 1,000 leading economists signed a massive petition begging President Herbert Hoover to veto the bill. They understood the mechanics of global trade. They warned that if the U.S., the biggest market in the world, suddenly locked its doors to foreign goods, it would trigger a catastrophic chain reaction.
But Hoover feels the immense political pressure from Congress, and he signs it into law. And exactly what the economists predicted happens. The tariff sparks a massive global trade war.
Think about the mechanics of retaliation here. When the U.S. puts a 50% tax on French wine or German steel, France and Germany immediately retaliate by putting a 50% tax on American cars and wheat. Suddenly, global shipping freezes. Ports go quiet. And think about what that specific freeze means for Germany. The U.S. loans that were keeping their currency afloat have just stopped. And now, because of the global tariff war, Germany's massive export market sold, the factories that were keeping millions of men employed is instantly annihilated.
You can't sell their goods anywhere.
Exactly. The national banks in Vienna and Berlin collapse under the strain.
So here's where it gets really interesting and profoundly disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
We are literally mapping out how internal U.S. banking policies and a panicked protectionist trade tariff stripped the economic floorboards right out from under the Weimar Republic. It's like pulling the plug on a patient's life support machine.
It is staggering when you connect those dots.
Yeah.
The German public, who had just spent a grueling decade recovering from the trauma of the war and the insanity of hyperinflation, who had just started to believe in democracy, are suddenly plunged right back into absolute terrifying ruin.
Yeah.
Unemployment skyrockets, millions of men are thrown out onto the streets.
Which brings us to the political void of the early 1930s. We have this era of the velvet glove and the iron fist. Because the crucial question is, how does the mainstream democratic political establishment in Germany react to this sudden economic ruin?
They react with what they believe is fiscal responsibility, which turns out to be political suicide.
Ouch.
Chancellor Heinrich Brüning takes power, and he looks at the collapsing tax revenues and the massive national debt, and he decides the only mathematical way out is severe austerity.
And by austerity, we mean he radically tightens the government's belt. He forces through emergency decrees that lower wages across the board, slash unemployment benefits, and cut government jobs, all while rents and the basic cost of living are going up.
This raises a profoundly important question about human behavior and government policy during a crisis. There is an iron law of democracies. When the traditional centrist political establishment imposes severe economic pain on the working and middle classes in the name of balancing the budget, the public will eventually revolt.
Of course they will.
If you have lost your job, your savings are gone, and you cannot feed your children, you do not care about the gold standard or national debt ratios, you look at the center, see that it has failed you, and you look for radical alternatives.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah.
The desperate public turns away from the moderate center and looks to the extremes. They look at the communists on the far left, and they look at the Nazis on the far right. This is the classic horseshoe theory in action.
Now, we have to be very careful to note here that communism and Nazism were not the same thing, just wrapped in different colored flags.
Right.
They were radically different ideologies with vastly different end goals.
Right, because communism, in theory at that time, was promising a classless, egalitarian proletariat society. Overthrow the wealthy industrialists, get rid of the aristocrats, everyone wears the same drab workers' uniform, and the state owns everything.
Right.
Whereas Nazism explicitly rejected equality. They wanted elites. They harkened back to the rigid imperial militarism of Otto von Bismarck. They wanted shiny leather uniforms, strict social and racial hierarchies, and the elevation of a so-called master race above all others.
Fundamentally incompatible visions of the future. But where the horseshoe theory applies is in their psychological appeal during a moment of supreme crisis. Both extremes offered desperate, impoverished, terrified people a gang to join.
A lifeline.
A club that provided a hot meal, a uniform, a sense of belonging, and most importantly, a promise to take a sledgehammer to the failing democratic system that was currently starving them.
And Hitler, sensing the vulnerability of the moment, adapts brilliantly. He learned from the failed putsch in 1923 that he can't just march with guns. He decides to run a hyper-modern, legitimate political campaign.
He was very modern.
He is chartering airplanes to fly across Germany, which was revolutionary at the time, the Hitler over Germany campaign, delivering 3 or 4 massive speeches a day to farmers, factory workers, university students. He is tapping right back into that exact same anger he harnessed in the beer halls in 1923, but now the entire country is receptive to it because the stability of the Golden 20s is dead and buried.
Yet, despite this massive surge in popularity and relentless campaigning, we have to remember a critical fact here. The Nazis actually lost seats in the Reichstag between the summer and November elections of 1932.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They had peaked electorally. The public was starting to tire of the constant violence of the SA on the streets. Hitler did not win an outright majority, and he certainly didn't violently overthrow the government in a coup.
Then how did he get in?
The conservative political elites of Germany actually offered him the keys to the state.
That is the most chilling part of the entire timeline. January 1933. The traditional conservative elites, the aristocrats, the wealthy industrialists, they are terrified of the communists taking over and seizing their property.
Terrified of them.
So they go to President Hindenburg, the old WWI general, and they convince him to offer Hitler the chancellorship in a coalition government. They arrogantly think, look, he's a loudmouth populist, he has a base we need, but we will surround him with traditional conservatives in the cabinet. We can control him.
We'll blunt his sword, use his popularity to crush the communists, and replace him in a few months.
It is the classic fatal hubris of the political establishment, believing they can tame a radical strongman by putting him in a suit and bringing him into the tent.
And how long did that take to backfire?
It took Hitler a matter of weeks to dismantle the Republic. He uses the crisis of the Reichstag fire to pass the Enabling Act. He outlaws all other political parties, crushes the labor unions, and abolishes democracy entirely. The chancellor swiftly transforms into the absolute Führer. Okay, so by 1934, he has absolute uncontested dictatorial power. But he still has a ruined economy with millions of unemployed people to fix. And this is where the grand economic sham begins.
It's all smoke and mirrors.
Right. Because if you look at the propaganda of the 1930s, people around the world genuinely thought Hitler had created an economic miracle. He's building the Autobahns, everyone suddenly has jobs, the factories are roaring, they're hosting the 1936 Olympics in Berlin.
How did he pull that off if the country was completely broke just a few years earlier?
He pulled it off through a massive, secretive financial sleight of hand. He completely funneled the entire German economy toward rapid secret rearmament. And he funded this massive public works and military buildup using what were essentially highly complex government IOUs.
IOU.
Specifically off-the-books bonds that disguised the national debt. It was completely unsustainable. He borrowed astronomical amounts of money from the future to put everyone to work building a military in the present.
He explicitly told his inner circle that the state was already at war economically. They were just building their physical strength before the shooting started.
It was a literal house of cards.
Oh.
A completely fake, overheated military economy built entirely on debt and the promise of future conquest to pay it off. And what's wild is that the whole world, including the British and the French, bought into the illusion of this invincible, futuristic Nazi war machine.
They totally bought it.
Which brings us to the outbreak of WWI in 1939 and the great myth of Blitzkrieg.
Right. Because Hitler's domestic miracle mathematically required a war of conquest to sustain itself, right?
Right.
Otherwise, the debt would come due and crash the state harder than in 1929.
So they had to go to war.
They had to. But when war actually breaks out, the German military that rolls across the borders is absolutely not the highly mechanized, invincible juggernaut that the History Channel and old propaganda reels have burned into our collective memory.
I want you to tell the audience the statistic about the horses, because when I read this, it completely broke my brain. We all have this image of the Nazi army as an endless wave of sleek panzers and mechanized half-tracks. How accurate is that?
It is wildly inaccurate. The German army used 2.5 million horses during the Second World War.
2.5 million.
2.5 million. To put that in perspective, that is a million more horses than the Imperial German Army used during the entirety of World War I.
That is insane.
The vast, overwhelming bulk of the German infantry in WWII was not mechanized. They were walking on foot, and their supplies, their artillery, their food was being pulled by horse-drawn wooden carts, just like it was in the 19th century.
So wait, let's unpack the reality of their armor. If they are relying on millions of horses, how many of their actual fighting divisions were modernized?
In May 1940, during the massive invasion of France and the Low Countries, out of roughly 135 total German divisions, only 17 were motorized or panzer divisions.
17 out of 135.
Exactly. The rest were traditional foot-slogging infantry. The image of total mechanization was brilliant propaganda, basically smoke and mirrors designed to terrify their enemies.
But hold on. If only 17 divisions were actually modernized, how on earth did they conquer Poland, Norway, and France so fast? How did they trick the entire world and even their own high command into thinking they were this unstoppable futuristic force?
It comes down to a specific tactical doctrine combined with one incredibly cheap, unassuming piece of technology. The doctrine was called Bewegungskrieg, which translates to maneuver warfare.
Not Blitzkrieg.
No, the term Blitzkrieg was actually coined by Western journalists, not the German military. The Germans realized from their bitter failures in the static trenches of WWI that if you manage to make a breakthrough in the enemy line, you have to be able to communicate instantly to exploit it before the enemy can plug the gap.
Okay, that makes sense.
In WWI, they relied on runners like Hitler himself or buried telephone lines, which took hours to relay a message. By the time the generals knew there was a breakthrough, the opportunity was gone.
But the Nazis recognized the power of wireless communication. They mass-produced cheap two-way radios, and they didn't make them out of expensive wood or heavy metals. They made them out of bakelite, an early form of plastic.
Right.
And they put a radio receiver and transmitter in every single tank, every command truck, and even on sidecar motorcycles.
That is the real secret weapon of 1940. It allowed for instantaneous combined arms coordination on the battlefield. A panzer division wasn't just a bunch of tanks rolling forward blindly. It was a tightly integrated fist of tanks, motorized infantry, anti-tank guns, artillery, and close air support from dive bombers, all talking to each other in real time.
Unprecedented coordination.
Exactly. A junior commander in a tank could spot a bunker, get on the radio, and call in an airstrike or artillery barrage within minutes. They could concentrate overwhelming force at a single narrow point, what they called the Schwerpunkt, smack through the line, and then adapt on the fly, driving deep into the enemy rear to cause chaos.
Meanwhile, look at the French. The French army in 1940 was massive. It was widely considered the most powerful land army in the world. They actually had more tanks, and in many cases, better armored tanks than the Germans.
They did.
But they were still fighting the last war. They spread their tanks out evenly among the infantry instead of grouping them together. And crucially, they relied on stationary bunkers, landline telephones, and dispatch runners on motorcycles to communicate.
And the fall of France in 1940 perfectly illustrates the triumph of communication over sheer numbers. The Germans don't win through overwhelming mechanical superiority. They win by acting and reacting faster than the French command structure could process information.
It was an information war.
Right. They take a massive gamble and push their panzers through the dense Ardennes forest, exploiting a weakly defended river crossing at Sedan, which is ironically the exact same corridor they used to invade in 1870 and 1914.
You'd think the French would have guarded it better.
You'd think. But once they cross the river, they just outmaneuver the sluggish French forces, defeating them in what the British called penny packets before the French generals in Paris could even understand where the front line was to form a counterattack.
It looked like sheer genius. It looked like dark magic.
Yeah.
When Hitler returns to Berlin in the summer of 1940 after the fall of Paris, he's treated like a literal demigod.
Yeah.
Even the skeptical, aristocratic Prussian generals who previously thought he was a dangerous amateur suddenly believe he is an unparalleled military savant.
But that is exactly when the supreme hubris sets in. They start believing their own propaganda. And the fatal flaw of this entire sham operation, the lack of actual deep industrial strength, is brutally exposed just a few months later during the Battle of Britain.
Right, because for all their dazzling success maneuvering tanks on land, Germany's strategy to jump the English Channel and invade Britain Operation Sea Lion was completely delusional.
It was a fantasy. They had no specialized landing craft. They were planning to use flat-bottomed river barges that would have capsized in the channel waves.
Barges?
Yeah. They had absolutely no experience with complex amphibious assaults. And most importantly, their surface navy had been badly mauled in Norway and was nowhere near capable of taking on the Royal Navy, which was the most powerful fleet on Earth.
So they needed to control the sky.
Exactly. Their entire plan rested on a single prerequisite. The Luftwaffe had to completely destroy the Royal Air Force to control the skies over the channel.
And they fail. They completely underestimate the British air defense network. The integrated use of radar, the observer corps, the tightly controlled radio coordination of the fighter squadrons. The Luftwaffe takes heavy, unsustainable losses, and by the autumn of 1940, Hitler is forced to indefinitely postpone the invasion.
And we must recognize this as the true turning point that eventually seals Germany's fate. Because by failing to knock Britain out of the war, Hitler is suddenly trapped in a nightmare scenario. He is facing a relentless British naval blockade. Germany does not have access to the world's oceans. And remember, their domestic economy was a debt-fueled sham that was now entirely reliant on cannibalizing the resources of the countries they conquered. They are running out of everything.
The logistics of their conquests are fascinating. When they conquered France, they didn't just take the territory. They literally looted the country. They stole 92% of France's motorized vehicles to give to their own army.
92%.
They took their coal, their food, their industrial machinery. But it's a parasite killing its host. You can't run a conquered, sophisticated industrial nation if you confiscate all their trucks and drain their fuel reserves. The French economy grinds to a halt, meaning it can't produce the weapons and supplies Germany desperately needs to continue the war.
And the most critical shortage of all was oil. Modern mechanized warfare burns fuel at an astronomical rate. At that time, the world's biggest oil producers were the United States, Venezuela, and the Caucasus region in the Soviet Union. Because of the British blockade, Germany has zero access to the first two. They're running on fumes. If the Nazi state is going to survive, if the war machine is going to keep moving, Hitler mathematically must secure the oil fields in the Caucasus and the vast wheat fields in Ukraine.
Which means he has to break his non-aggression pact with Stalin. He has to invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, June 1941. This is the fatal overreach.
Hitler's trapped by the logic of his own victories. He has no choice but to push east, returning to the very Lebensraum blueprint he wrote in prison. But the planning for Barbarossa is a masterclass in catastrophic, blinding hubris.
We have to talk about the internal German planning here, specifically General Friedrich Paulus and the top military economist, General George Thomas. These were the guys tasked with calculating the logistics and the economic viability of invading the USSR.
Yeah, they were the numbers guys.
Right. They sit down, they run the hard numbers on fuel consumption, railway capacity, and food distribution. They take their report to high command and literally say, this won't work. We don't have the logistical tail to supply an army that deep into Russia, and we won't be able to extract the grain fast enough to feed our own troops, let alone Germany.
And how does high command respond to objective reality?
They ignore it.
Worse. They tell Paulus and Thomas, go back and do the math again until the numbers work. They are essentially ordered to fake the logistical reports to tell Hitler what he wants to hear. They planned the invasion based on the war as they imagined it in their propaganda, not as it actually existed in reality.
It was logistical suicide.
Yeah.
Let's just look at the mechanics of this invasion. They are attacking across a 1,200-mile front from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. To sustain an advance, armies rely on trains. But as the German army pushes 500 to 750 kilometers away from their railheads, the system breaks down. And the most absurd detail, the trains don't even work because the Soviet railway tracks were built on a wider gauge than the standard European tracks.
Yes, the Russians deliberately used a broader track gauge specifically to hinder invasions.
Brilliant.
So as the Germans advanced, they couldn't just use captured Soviet railways. They had to literally tear up and manually relay thousands of miles of track to fit their own trains, which drastically slowed down the delivery of food, ammunition, and winter clothing.
And think about the motorized vehicles. We mentioned they looted Europe. That meant they brought over 2,000 different types of vehicles into Russia. 2,000 different models of trucks, cars, and half-tracks stolen from the French, the Czechs, the Dutch, the British at Dunkirk.
Paint the picture of what that means for a supply chain. Imagine a freezing German mechanic, ankle-deep in the freezing Russian mud, the Rasputitsa, in November. A French-built Renault truck breaks down. He needs a specific distributor cap or a unique gasket. He can't just order a standard German part.
Yep.
He has to request a specific French part, which has to be found in a warehouse in Paris, shipped across Europe on a train whose tracks are being rebuilt, and then dragged through the mud by horses to reach him. And the maintenance manual is written in French, which he can't read. Managing the spare parts for that Frankenstein fleet was literally impossible.
This is the perfect definition of that culmination point you mentioned earlier. It's the exact moment an attacking force stretches its supply line so thin and exhausts its men so completely that it loses its tactical advantage. The Germans hit their culmination point deep in Soviet territory, just miles from Moscow. The gears freeze, the horses die in the cold, and they just run out of steam.
And waiting for them at that culmination point was the terrifying reality of the Red Army. The German intelligence had vastly underestimated Soviet strength. They thought it would be a rotten structure that would collapse if they kicked the door in.
They were very wrong.
Very wrong. The USSR had the largest standing military in the world. They were ruthlessly willing to trade millions of lives for time, and they had relocated their massive factories past the Ural Mountains, producing robust, highly effective weapons like the T-34 tank and artillery at an astonishing, relentless rate.
By December 1941, the German advance stalls completely in the snow outside Moscow. And let's look at the strategic reality of that specific month. In June 1941, Germany had one main enemy fighting them, the British Empire. Fast forward 6 months to December. They're completely bogged down in a frozen war of attrition in Russia, and within a matter of days, following Pearl Harbor, Hitler incomprehensibly declares war on the United States.
Yeah.
They are now simultaneously fighting the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the industrial leviathan of the USA.
From a purely mathematical industrial standpoint, it is game over. There is absolutely no way a resource-starved nation the size of Germany wins a prolonged war of attrition against the three greatest industrial empires on Earth.
None. But this is exactly where the story shifts from a narrative of military failure and logistical hubris into a descent into absolute unfathomable horror. Because the invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't just about securing oil or wheat.
No. From the very moment Hitler conceptualized it in that mountain cabin, it was fundamentally designed as a war of total ideological annihilation. And it is during this Eastern campaign that the Nazi policy definitively shifts from severe, terrible persecution and forced emigration into the industrialized, systematic extermination of human beings, the Holocaust.
It is deeply unsettling but important to trace the chilling genesis of how this methodology evolved. When Hitler took absolute power in 1933, the immediate explicit plan wasn't industrialized gas chambers. There were no blueprints for Auschwitz in 1933. The initial brutal goal was to make life so utterly intolerable for German Jews, stripping them of their citizenship, firing them from professions, passing the Nuremberg race laws that they would self-deport and leave Germany.
They were constantly testing the boundaries of what the public would accept. Kristallnacht in November 1938, the Night of Broken Glass, where SA thugs orchestrated the burning of hundreds of synagogues and the smashing of thousands of Jewish businesses, was a critical stress test.
Right.
The regime wanted to see what the average German citizen and the international community would tolerate in terms of open violence. And tragically, they learned that while people might grumble privately, no one was going to stand up and stop them.
But the true apocalyptic escalation happens under the cover of war in the East. As the Wehrmacht pushes into Poland and the Soviet Union, away from the eyes of the Western press, the war of annihilation begins. The SS deploys the Einsatzgruppen mobile death squads that follow right behind the advancing front lines. Their sole mission is to round up political commissars, partisans, and the entire Jewish populations of towns and villages, march them into the woods or to the edges of ravines, and conduct mass shootings.
But the evolution from those mass shootings in the forests to the death camps reveals a terrifying aspect of bureaucratic evil. The industrialized gas chambers were not initially born out of a desire for greater killing efficiency. They were actually born out of the perpetrator's own psychological discomfort.
This is one of the most grotesque details. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, travels to the Eastern Front in the summer of 1941 to witness a mass execution by his Einsatzgruppen. He stands by the pit, he witnesses the blood, the screams, the brains, and he actually becomes physically sickened.
Yeah, he nearly faints.
Right, and his takeaway from that isn't that the murderer is wrong. His takeaway is that his SS men shouldn't have to endure such psychological trauma from shooting women and children at point-blank range day after day. He demands a method of killing that is more humane, and by humane, He strictly and solely means less messy and less traumatic for the Nazi executioners.
They wanted physical and emotional distance from the act of murder. So they begin experimenting. They start with gas fans using carbon monoxide exhaust, and eventually they adapt Zyklon B, which was a widely available commercial pesticide used for fumigating barracks.
That was horrible.
And there is an insane, deeply bureaucratic detail regarding the construction of the massive gas chambers at Auschwitz. The implementation was actually delayed for a period because the civilian contractors developing the ventilation systems insisted on going through the legal process of patenting the extermination technology first.
It is the ultimate, sickening manifestation of the banality of evil. While hundreds of thousands of people are being systematically targeted for murder, men in suits are sitting in offices worrying about their intellectual property rights and profit margins for ventilation shafts.
And we must explicitly destroy the post-war myth of the clean Wehrmacht here. After the war, as the horrors of the camps were revealed, a lot of German generals and high-ranking civilian officials like Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and later Minister of Armaments, tried to sanitize their legacies.
Oh, they definitely did.
They claimed they were just honorable military men fighting a traditional war, or just apolitical technocrats managing factories, and that they had no idea what the SS was doing in the East.
Which is complete and utter nonsense. They were all up to their necks in the blood.
They absolutely were. The regular army provided the logistics for the death squads. They guarded the perimeters. They participated in atrocities. Men like Speer were deeply complicit architects of this nightmare. They enthusiastically bought into the ideology. They aggressively utilized millions of starved slave laborers from the concentration camps to run their underground weapons factories. And they fully enabled the machinery of annihilation. They were not innocent bystanders.
And looking at it from a purely cynical, detached military perspective, the Holocaust represents the darkest irony of the entire Nazi regime. It completely destroyed their own war effort.
Right. Yeah. Explain how that logistical conflict played out.
Think about the situation in 1944. Germany is losing the war on all fronts. The Soviets are pushing from the east, the Americans and British are pushing from the west, and bombing German cities into rubble. The German military is desperately begging for trains to move troops, for manpower to build defenses, for resources to keep fighting.
They're collapsing.
They're collapsing. And what does the Nazi leadership do? They prioritize the genocide. They devote massive, vital wartime resources, thousands of railway cars, scheduling priority on the tracks, and thousands of able-bodied personnel strictly to accelerating the industrial murder of millions of people.
It's madness.
Right when they mathematically knew the war was lost, like during the deportation of the Hungarian Jews in the spring of 1944, they actually expended scarce resources to build a brand new rail spur straight into the Birkenau extermination camp just to speed up the killing process. The ideological hatred completely, totally overrode any logical military strategy for survival.
Because for Hitler and his inner circle, the worldview was entirely binary. It was either total victory, the Thousand-Year Reich, or total apocalyptic Armageddon. There was no middle ground, no negotiated surrender.
Right.
If the German people were not strong enough to win the war, then in his eyes, they deserved to be destroyed along with their enemies. So they actively win themselves to death, pulling their own country and the entire continent of Europe down into the flames with them.
It is incredibly heavy to process. It's hard to wrap your head around that level of systemic, bureaucratic, destructive commitment. But if we pull back from the specific horrors of the 1930s and 40s, we have to look at the macro-historical patterns here, because the whole point of studying this isn't just to memorize dates, it's to recognize the warning signs. History rarely repeats itself perfectly, but it definitely rhymes.
If we connect the mechanics of the Weimar collapse to the bigger picture of our world today, the parallels between the 1920s and our modern era are, frankly, deeply unsettling.
Let's lay out the rhyming ingredients.
Yeah.
100 years ago, coming out of the 1910s, the world had just suffered a massive global pandemic, the Spanish flu, which killed millions and traumatized a generation.
Yes.
They had economically ruinous, destabilizing conflicts. They had a massive, system-shocking financial crash in 1929. And they had a global trade tariff war triggered by Smoot-Hawley that destroyed international supply chains.
Now look at the landscape of the last 20 years. We have just emerged from a massive global pandemic that disrupted every aspect of life. We've spent trillions on ruinous, incredibly divisive wars in the Middle East and witnessed new, massive conflicts breaking out in Europe and elsewhere. We experienced a system-shaking financial crash in 2008 that wiped out middle-class wealth.
Yeah.
And we are currently navigating an era of renewed protectionism, modern tariff battles, and fracturing global trade. The contextual ingredients of societal stress are strikingly, uncomfortably similar.
And that leads us to the ultimate takeaway here. That iron law of democracies we discussed earlier, economic decline plus political dislocation equals radicalization.
Human nature does not fundamentally change. People across all eras need three basic things. They need a tribe to belong to, they need a sense of purpose, and they need a reliable paycheck to feed their families and maintain their dignity.
Right, the basics.
When the established political center, the traditional moderate democratic institutions, fails to provide those basics, society fractures. When inflation bites hard, when wages stagnate for decades, when people feel they can't pay their rent or buy a home while elites prosper, they get desperate.
And when a population gets desperate, they do not vote for cautious, moderate reform. They vote for the wrecking ball. Because if you feel like the current status quo is actively destroying your life, why wouldn't you take a chance on the guy promising to smash the entire corrupt system to pieces?
Which brings us to the core economic debate of how a society prevents that radicalization from taking root. When a crisis hits, how should a government respond? We saw how Chancellor Brüning's severe austerity doomed the Weimar Republic.
Right, by cutting everything.
By cutting government spending, slashing safety nets, and imposing pain on the working class to balance the books, he drove desperate people straight into the arms of the Nazis. The historical argument here is that modern austerity during a crisis, trying to shrink your way to prosperity, stagnates a nation, breeds profound resentment, and fuels political extremism.
So the alternative to austerity, according to this analysis, is the Keynesian approach.
Yeah.
You borrow heavily to invest in your own people.
Yes. In times of severe economic crisis, the government has to act counter-cyclically. Instead of tightening the belt when the private sector is collapsing, the state has to step in and invest massively. Whether that means investing in sweeping infrastructure projects, modernizing the energy grid, or rebuilding domestic manufacturing, whatever it takes to create tangible, well-paying jobs.
Give them a purpose.
You give the public a sense of shared national purpose and, most importantly, a salary. Look at the United States in 1940. They were still struggling to fully pull out of the Great Depression, but the government borrowed heavily to invest in the arsenal of democracy, massive armaments production.
It was a massive fiscal risk.
Huge risk, but it ultimately rebuilt the American middle class, supercharged the economy, and unified a fractured country behind a common goal.
It's about giving people a tangible stake in the system. If people feel the system is working for them, they don't want to burn it down.
Precisely. The center must hold by delivering real material security, because if the traditional political center fails to provide a viable, hopeful path forward, there will always be extremists waiting in the wings, ready to step into the void with easy, comforting scapegoats and incredibly dangerous promises.
So let's recap this incredible, sobering journey we've been on. We started in a cold room in Vienna with a lonely, failed artist. We saw him traumatized in a hospital bed by the sudden loss of his military tribe. We watched him tap into a nation's collective anger, only to be empowered not by a brilliant master plan, but by a catastrophic global economic crash, which was significantly triggered by American banking withdrawals and panic tariff policies.
Yeah, that U.S. connection is key.
We saw him build a sham, debt-fueled economy and a paper tiger military that succeeded purely through the novel use of plastic radios, maneuver warfare, and stolen resources. And finally, we saw how his own inflexible ideological hubris led him to fatally overreach into Russia, resulting in ultimate national ruin and unparalleled industrialized human tragedy.
Dissecting this history strips away the terrifying but somewhat comforting myth of the omnipotent evil mastermind, and it replaces it with a reality that is perhaps even more terrifying. The reality of total systemic fragility.
Yeah.
The knowledge that civilization is a thin veneer heavily dependent on the global flow of capital and resources.
Being well-informed means looking past that simple X-ray snapshot of history. It means doing the hard work to see the complex, incredibly fragile economic and societal levers that actually dictate whether a society thrives or descends into madness.
It's recognizing that historical catastrophes are rarely just about one broken bone. They are about the entire circulatory system of a society slowly failing until a pathogen is allowed to take over the whole body.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. If Hitler's rise to absolute dictatorial power was truly mechanically dependent on the sudden shock of the 1929 Wall Street crash and the subsequent reactionary trade tariff wars that froze the global economy. What specific modern economic policies are we fiercely debating right now that might be unknowingly paving the way for the next great wrecking ball? The gears and mechanics of history are always grinding in the background, even when we can't hear them. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.